Records in renewable generation were achieved in 2022 for wind, both onshore and offshore, and solar PV. Overall total renewable generation in 2022 was broadly in line with the previous record set in 2020, when unusually high wind speed and rainfall hit the UK. Where the previous 2020 record for renewable generation was driven by favourable weather conditions, the current record was driven primarily by new capacity, particularly in offshore wind, which returned to the same level as in 2018, 3.8 gigawatts, of which 2.7 gigawatt was offshore wind, 0.7 gigawatt in solar PV, and 0.3 gigawatt in onshore wind. Compared to 2021, generation was 10.4% higher, although weather conditions weren't as favorable as in 2020. Wind speeds and sun hours were higher than in 2021. As a proportion of total generation, renewables accounted for 41.4%, 1.8% point higher than in 2021, though 1.8% points lower than the previous record in 2020. Chart 6.1 shows the year-on-year changes in generation since the previous record year 2020, between 2020 and 2021, and 2021 to 2022, and the total change during this period. Generation fell in 2021 by 9.3% but increased by 10% in 2022, with the negligible increase over the period as a whole, 0.1%. The fall in 2021 was the result of considerably lower wind speeds and rainfall. 2020 had been unusually favorable for both, and lower levels for new capacity. During 2022, weather conditions recovered somewhat, particularly wind speeds and average daily sun hours, though the primary driver in generation growth was the turnaround in new capacity, most notably in offshore wind, but also in solar PV and onshore wind. Chart 6.2 highlights the interaction between capacity and generation between 2020, the previous record year, and 2022. The trends in wind generation over the time period are striking in comparing onshore and offshore wind, with wind speeds lower in 2022 compared to 2020. Increases in capacity resulted in higher generation for both technologies, but the increase in offshore generation is considerably larger compared to onshore wind due to much greater level of new capacity. Hydro generation was lower in 2022 as rainfall level reverted towards the long-term mean. Hydro capacity is currently stable, whereas 2020 saw record levels. With capacity being fairly stable in bioenergy, the 9.9% fall in generation was due to outages at two major power producers. The interaction of weather patterns, new capacity, and the fall in bioenergy generation resulted in generation in 2022, that is 134.8 TWh, being in line with that in 2020, that is 134.7 TWh. New capacity installed in 2022 reached 3.8 gigawatt, matching 2018. Chart 6.3 shows the quarterly trends in new capacity since 2018 by technology. Most notable is the spike in the first quarter of 2022, when 1.5 gigawatts was installed in offshore wind alone. New offshore wind continued to come online in the second and third quarters before dropping off in the fourth. For the year as a whole, 2.7 gigawatt in offshore wind was installed, including Quayside at Moray East, 1.0 gigawatt, and Seagreen, 0.3 gigawatts in Scotland, as well as Hornsea 2 in England, 1.4 gigawatts. In the fourth quarter, new solar PV capacity outstripped that for offshore wind, accounting for half the new installed capacity, with an additional 0.2 gigawatts. This, combined with high level of sun hours, resulted in record quarterly generation. For the year as a whole, solar PV capacity increased by 0.7 gigawatts, that is 5%, mostly micro-generation scheme of less than 50 kilowatts. There were around 112,000 new domestic solar installations in 2022, the highest number since 2015. These accounted for around 60% of the new capacity. This, combined with unusually high sun hours, that is not just Q4 but also during the heat wave in the third quarter, ensure an annual record as well as a quarterly. In 2022 quarter 4, renewables share of generation was 44.4%, 1.3 percentage points higher than in 2021, with some notable changes across the renewable technologies. Reflecting the additional capacity during the year, offshore wind's share of generation increased from 14.4% to 18.6%, but this was offset by the fall in bioenergy's share, that is from 12.8% to 9.6%, due to outages at 2 power stations.